Somewhere in the deep woods, a legend knelt, not in defeat, but in gratitude. In the summer of 1995, deep in the Adirondack Mountains, an elderly widow named Mabel Quinn made a choice that changed two worlds. She heard the cry of something lost, and found a small, fur-covered child beside the crushed body of its mother. Not human, not beast, Keeva. What followed wasn't magic. It was mercy. Mabel left water in tin cups, food on the porch. She never touched Keeva. But in silence, a bond grew. A silent trust between a grieving woman and a creature the world called a monster. The truth no one talks about? Bigfoot isn't violent. It's loyal, protective, grateful. And when humans came to hunt him, Keeva didn't strike back. He shielded the one who saved him. With leaves, with stones, with silence. This story comes from the final letters of Mabel Quinn, the only person a Bigfoot ever bowed to. And if you stay with us, you'll discover how an entire village changed, how a wild creature brought back the gentlest part of being human. Now, we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Could this story travel from the forests of New York to your heart, your home, your corner of the world? If this story moved you even just a little, tap that like and subscribe to join a growing community that believes Bigfoot isn't just real, it remembers. From our forest to yours, with love. Thank you for being here. It was the kind of summer morning that clung to your skin before you even stepped outside. The air in Adirondack Park was thick with humidity, still not yet burned off by the sun climbing behind the trees. Mabel Quinn stood at the edge of her porch, holding a weathered kerosene lantern in one hand, even though dawn had broken hours ago. It was a habit, not a necessity. After all these years living alone in this old timber cabin on the edge of the forest, some things just stayed with her, like reaching for that lantern when something didn't feel right. That morning it was the sound. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a fox's bark or a mountain cat's scream either. Those, she knew. This was something else. A sound that started low and then caught in itself, like a sob half swallowed, then stretched long into something aching. Not human, not animal, not anything she could name. Just wrong in the kind of way that made your chest tighten. She'd heard things in the woods before. Strange things. But nothing had ever made her pick up that lantern and step off her porch before. Her boots sank slightly into the soft ground as she followed the sound. The trees rose around her like they always had, silent and tall, holding in the last threads of early fog. She moved carefully, eyes scanning through breaks in the brush, her breath catching in rhythm with that cry, coming from somewhere up the eastern ridge. The hill beyond the ridge had always been one she avoided. Too many rocks, too many places to fall. But the cry kept pulling her forward like a thread through the chest. When she reached the top, the world went quiet for a heartbeat. And then she saw it, down near the base of a boulder, half sunken into the soft soil where the rock slide must have hit, was a body. A massive shape, collapsed like a felled tree, covered in thick dark brown fur. It wasn't a bear. Mabel knew bears. This was taller, even hunched, limbs longer, chest broader. And beside it, tucked close to its side, was something smaller, alive. The little one was crouched, its arms wrapped around its knees, rocking slightly, trembling. The sound she'd followed poured from it, those dry, breaking cries. And then it looked up. Amber eyes met hers. She stopped breathing. It had a face, not a snout, not fur all the way down like a wolf or ape, but a face with skin under the fine fur, high cheekbones, brows set low, a short beard that blended into its downy jawline. It was a child, not a human child. No, but something close, something painfully close. Mabel took one step back, then another. The old ranger warnings echoed in her head. Don't interfere. Nature knows what it's doing. She'd followed that rule her whole life, watched birds fall from nests, watched deer limp off to die. She turned, throat tight, hands cold even in the heat. But the crying didn't stop. If anything, it grew louder. She paused halfway down the slope, heart pounding, and looked over her shoulder. It was following her, the little thing, on its hands and knees at first, then slowly rising onto two legs, swaying with effort. It wasn't chasing her. It was trying to stay near her. Its fur was matted, eyes glassy. And as she backed toward the edge of the woods, she saw it stumble forward, crawling, dragging one foot. It was weak, hurt, or scared, or both. She hesitated, then kept walking. The old trail behind her cabin was just 100 feet away. She could already see the break in the trees. Then came the sound again, not a cry this time, not a voice, just a rustle. Coyotes, 3 of them, low to the grass, circling from the tree line, drawn to the scent. She saw them before the creature did. Without thinking, Mabel reached into her pocket and pulled out the soft blue handkerchief she always kept. It was faded now, edges frayed. It had belonged to her daughter, her last thing. She clutched it once, then tossed it into the tall grass toward the coyotes. The scent would pull them that way, maybe long enough for the little one to get clear. She didn't look back. When she stepped onto the trail again, the sun had risen higher, spilling golden heat across the dirt path. She turned toward her house, breathing hard. Then she stopped. It was there. The little one had followed her. It stood at the edge of the grass, just off the trail, swaying slightly. Its chest heaved with each breath, arms hanging low but not threatening. Those amber eyes, huge and wet, locked on hers. It didn't speak. It didn't cry. It just stood there like it was waiting for something. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Instead, she looked down and noticed the grass behind it had been bent, flattened in a pattern, a set of heavy tracks running parallel to hers, just feet away. She hadn't been alone. Not really. Later that evening, after the light had drained from the sky and the tree shadows swallowed the yard, Mabel stepped out onto the porch. The lantern burned low beside her, hissing quietly. She felt it before she saw it. Out past the clearing, between 2 pine trees, a shape, taller than any man, broader than the old bear mounts she used to see in ranger cabins, stood still as stone. The mist curled around its legs, and then the eyes opened, amber, glowing, just for a second. They blinked, then vanished into the fog. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She just stood there, the wooden floor cool beneath her bare feet, the night suddenly very quiet. The next morning, just past dawn, she found a line of river stones laid out in a perfect straight path, leading from the edge of the trees to her porch. Someone had been here before her. Someone had known she'd come back with it. She didn't touch the stones. She didn't move them. She simply stood at the top step, blinking back something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't fear. That had passed. What she felt now was older, deeper, like she was standing at the edge of something sacred, and it had chosen her. Not because she was strong or wise, but maybe because no one else had listened. She moved through the day in silence, her every step accompanied by the memory of those eyes and the heavy presence that had watched her from the trees. She didn't speak aloud, not even to herself, until late afternoon when she opened the cabinet beneath the sink and found an old tin cup. She didn't know what she planned to do with it exactly. Her hands just moved. She filled it with water, walked it outside, set it at the edge of the porch where the line of river stones ended. She didn't call out, didn't wave, just placed it down and stepped back inside. That night, she woke to silence. Then a soft clink of metal. She sat up slowly, her joints protesting, and crept to the window. The cup was gone. In its place, a single acorn shell, perfectly split and hollowed out, resting on the top step. She didn't sleep the rest of the night. Not because she was afraid, but because her chest ached in a way it hadn't in years. Not from sorrow this time, but from something unfamiliar and just beginning to bloom. A quiet connection. A wordless thank you. Morning came with heat and heavy clouds. She stepped outside to find the tin cup placed neatly to the side of the door, as if whoever had borrowed it understood how to return something without needing to be seen. She crouched beside it, ran her fingers across the rim. It was still cool from the creek. That day, she walked back to the place where she'd left the handkerchief. The grass was trampled. The stone she remembered was gone. So was the body. No blood, no scent. As if the earth had swallowed the memory clean. But beneath a low cedar branch, she saw it. Her daughter's handkerchief. Folded, placed on a flat rock. Someone had returned it. She reached for it with trembling hands. And just before her fingers touched the fabric, she saw the smallest thing lying beside it. 3 stones stacked, not randomly, but with intent. 2 small, 1 large. The same shape as her family once. Mabel didn't cry often, not since the funeral. But there, on that hill, she let herself bend slowly to the earth and weep. Not because she was sad, but because something in the world had remembered her. The days that followed blurred together. She heard footsteps some nights, soft, careful ones that circled the porch but never came closer. The child didn't cry anymore. It didn't have to. Sometimes she'd find other things. Small braided twigs shaped like a circle, placed on the woodpile. Or wildflowers tucked into the fence slats. A single feather balanced upright on the porch railing. Little signs. Little words in a language she didn't speak, but understood all the same. One evening, while watering the plants that still grew in the rusted metal tubs out back, she looked up to see the child again. Keeva, though she hadn't spoken that name aloud yet. She already knew it belonged to him. He stood just past the tree line, half-shadowed, half-luminous in the fading light. He didn't move forward. He didn't need to. He just watched as she tended the roots, then mimicked her motions, stooping to touch the earth beside a fern, tilting his head when she poured water at the base. He was learning, not just how to survive, but how to coexist. And Mabel, without fully realizing it, was beginning to remember how it felt to nurture. Not because she had to, but because something in her had longed for it. That night, the dogs howled in the far valley. She heard them but didn't flinch. Somewhere out there, someone was still listening, still watching. The woods were not silent. They were just patient. When she stepped out onto the porch one last time before bed, she saw something glimmer in the moonlight. A faint shape at the far edge of her clearing, just beyond the garden, where the shadows bled into trees. Tall, still, and then the eyes opened. Amber, steady, not the child. This was something older, larger. A guardian, maybe. Or a witness. She didn't move. The eyes didn't blink. And in the hush between heartbeat and breath, Mabel felt something settle. Like the forest itself had exhaled. Like the last page of a long-lost letter had finally been read aloud. Then, as if pulled back into mist, the shape vanished, not with violence, not with fear. Just a quiet, deliberate turning. A retreat into the deep green silence from which it had come. She stood there long after the night had swallowed it whole. Lantern in hand, wind in her hair, the hush of pine needles brushing together like soft whispers between old friends. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Somewhere nearby, something wild and sacred had chosen her. Not because she was worthy, but because she'd listened, and she would listen still. Under the slow drag of moonlight, the Adirondack woods shifted in quiet ways. Trees creaked like bones remembering old winters. The wind didn't howl, not anymore. It pressed gently through the pine needles like a hush laid over secrets. For nights after that first encounter, Mabel Quinn sat alone by her window with a kerosene lamp barely lit, hands curled around a chipped mug, listening. The cabin was still, but the silence wasn't empty. There were footsteps sometimes. soft ones, too deliberate to be deer, too steady to be wind. Something circled the house, not in menace, but in curiosity, in the kind of presence that doesn't want to be seen, but doesn't want to be forgotten either. She noticed it first in the mornings, the way the leaves on her porch were brushed aside as if swept by careful fingers, or the faint disturbances in the grass where the dew had been parted by someone walking barefoot. And once, just before dawn, she caught a glimpse of the young one, Keeva, crouched just outside the old wooden fence that framed her garden. He didn't step past it. He didn't cry. He just sat there, watching, waiting. That morning she filled a tin cup with cool water and placed it just past the gate, setting it down without a word, without a gesture. She didn't look at him, didn't coax him closer. The rules were beginning to form, not out loud, but quietly, out of necessity and respect. She stepped back inside without glancing behind her, and when the sun rose fully, the cup had been emptied and placed gently on its side. Next to it, nestled against the wooden post, was an acorn shell, hollowed, polished smooth by small fingers or claws or something in between. A token, a wordless thank you. Days moved forward like that, in a rhythm as old as the hills. She left water, sometimes berries, occasionally a scrap of bread. Each time something was left in return. Feathers, stones, bits of moss braided together. None of it made logical sense, but it didn't have to. Something deeper was unfolding, like a conversation in a language neither had words for. Then came Royce Talbot. The truck pulled up the long gravel drive just before noon, tires crunching against the dry stones like thunder in her quiet world. She'd heard from town that someone had reported strange sounds echoing through the valley. Sounds that didn't belong to no coyote. She wasn't surprised to see the ranger's familiar silhouette step out, boots dusty, hat tucked low, shoulders bent more than they used to be. Royce was in his 70s now, carried himself like a man who'd seen more than he'd ever admit. Mabel poured him coffee without asking. They sat on the porch, the cicadas humming lazy above their heads, the tension between them neither warm nor cold. Just honest. He asked her if she'd heard anything strange lately. She said she might have. Then he told her something he hadn't told anyone in 30 years. Back in '68, he said, he'd been deep in the southern gorge, tracking a family of elk after a wildfire. Fog had rolled in, thick and low, and through it, he'd seen something move. Something tall, upright, and silent. Not a bear, not a man. Just a silhouette gliding through the ash like it knew where it was going. He didn't talk about it after. His partner had laughed when he tried, so he stopped trying. But he hadn't forgotten. Mabel didn't ask why he was telling her now. She just nodded, her fingers brushing the rim of her cup. Some truths need time to feel safe. That night Keeva came again. Mabel sat on the porch with her lantern lit low, the tin cup between them. He didn't step forward, but he watched her. She raised the cup to her lips and tapped it once, softly, with her fingernail before drinking. A simple gesture. Keeva copied it exactly, watching her hands, the way she held the cup, the timing of her sip. It wasn't mimicry. It was learning. Intentional. As if he were cataloging her movements, trying to understand not just what she did, but why. The next morning, when she went out to sweep the porch, she found small piles of earth disturbed in 3 corners of her yard. The grass had been pressed flat in arcs, as if something massive had stood there through the night. Not pacing, guarding. She didn't tell Royce. Not yet. Some things needed to be held close before they were handed over. Each night after, the rhythm returned. Water for a gift. Quiet for company. Trust, built not in grand moments, but in the small, tender silences between them. The boy never crossed the porch. Mabel never reached her hand out. They coexisted, not as owner and creature, but as something more ancient. Two beings that had found each other in the wide stretch of wilderness and grief. Then one morning the cup was missing. She searched the porch, the yard, the path. Nothing. No tracks. No gift. No sign. A whole day passed, then another. Her chest tightened more with each hour. The woods felt emptier somehow, like the echo of something that had been driven away. On the third morning, just as the mist began to lift, she saw him. Keeva emerged from the trees, staggering slightly, his small arms wrapped tightly around something. When he reached the edge of the porch, he dropped it gently on the step. A crayfish, still damp, its legs twitching slightly. A gift. A trade. Proof. She knelt slowly, the lantern's flame flickering behind her. The boy looked thinner, but stronger somehow. A little more certain of himself. He had found food, alone, and brought it back. That evening, she sat by the window with her journal open, pen hovering over the page. She didn't write words, just sketches. The cup, the acorn, the fish. A figure, not human, not animal, with eyes like fire behind amber. As the light faded, she stepped outside. On the porch, laid carefully beside the rocking chair, were 3 more acorn shells, arranged in a circle. Somewhere out in the woods, something old was watching, waiting. Maybe not just for Keeva, maybe for her too. And as the shadows grew longer and the wind pulled softly through the pines, Mabel began to understand that this thing in her life wasn't temporary. It wasn't an accident or a fluke of the wild. It was something returning, and whatever came next, she wasn't alone anymore. Under the heat-hazed skies of late July, the town began to buzz with the kind of rumors that crawl through barbershops and bait shops like flies on a porch screen. Folks whispered about screams echoing from the hills, not coyotes this time, but something stranger, something that sounded like grief, like thunder turned to voice. Mabel could feel the shift in the air before the knock ever came. People were looking too long at the woods now, talking too loud in the hardware store, making bets in bars over whether something was out there. And it didn't take long for the wrong ears to catch wind of the stories. Dax and Coulter Mays rolled into town in a red pickup with one busted headlight and a license plate half covered in mud. Brothers, but barely. Dax was the older one, the kind who thought anger was the only way to be heard. Coulter kept quieter, but there was something under his silence that wasn't peace. They hunted for money, not meat. Had a reputation for chasing game no one else wanted to get close to. And when word reached them about something big and strange in the Adirondacks, they didn't hesitate. They printed flyers with the words, "Cash Reward," stamped across the top and started asking questions no one wanted to answer. It wasn't long before one of Mabel's neighbors, a young woman with tired eyes and too many bills, let something slip. She didn't mean harm, just mentioned the strange lights out past Mabel's place, the sounds, the trail of little footprints in the mud. She needed the money, and desperation does strange things to people. By the time Mabel found out, the brothers were already scouting the ridge, moving with rifles slung lazy over their backs, like they owned the land, like they owned the truth. Mabel didn't panic. She never did. But that night, she sat long on the porch, longer than usual, her hands still on her lap, her breathing even. Keeva didn't show, and that scared her more than anything. The woods felt watchful. Even the wind held its breath. The next morning she packed a canvas bag, some dried apples, a wool blanket, her lantern, and a carved cedar charm that had once hung over her daughter's crib. Then she drove down the gravel road that curved out toward Finger Lakes, where an old barn stood quiet at the edge of Abner Cole's forgotten land. Abner was long gone, too old now, too tired to argue. The barn hadn't held livestock in decades, just dust and silence. It would have to be enough. She and Royce moved Keeva under cover of dusk. The boy didn't cry. He didn't speak. He simply followed Mabel with a kind of faith that hurt to look at. His small frame hunched against the weight of what he didn't understand, what he couldn't fight. Royce said nothing either. He just opened the back of the truck, helped the boy in with quiet hands, and drove with the headlights off until they reached the tree line. No one saw them. At least, they hoped no one did. The barn was damp, air thick with the smell of hay, long rotted and wood turned soft with time. But it had a roof. It had corners to hide in, and it had a loft that caught the morning sun through a crack in the boards. Mabel laid the blanket down, placed a bowl of water in the corner, and lit the lantern with slow hands. Keeva watched her every move, his eyes flicking between her and Royce, his small chest rising and falling with each breath like he was relearning what safety felt like. That night, while Royce checked the perimeter, Mabel found an old tin box wedged between the boards in the hayloft. Inside was a notebook, pages browned and curled, written in pencil so faded she had to hold it near the lantern to read. It was Abner's, dated July 1959. The entry was brief. He'd written about a storm, a real rager, and how he'd heard something singing outside the barn, low and deep, like wind caught in a hollow log. Said he felt the sound in his teeth. Said it wasn't a man. But it wasn't an animal either. Said he didn't open the door, but when the morning came, there were stones laid out in the shape of a spiral just past the fence. Said he'd burned the shirt he was wearing that night and never spoke of it again. Mabel ran her finger along the words. Felt something settle in her bones. This wasn't new. Keeva hadn't wandered here by accident. They'd been close all along, hidden in the folds of history people didn't want to look at. They'd been living beside us, not behind us. Royce returned just before dawn. Said the Mays brothers were still in town, still asking questions, but hadn't come this far yet. Mabel nodded. She didn't say what she'd found in the journal. Not yet. Days passed, quiet but taut. The barn became something close to home. Keeva began to move more freely, testing the edges of the walls, stacking small stones in corners, weaving thin grass into simple shapes. Mabel left food out near the door in a straight line. He always returned something in its place, a rhythm forming again, a fragile piece. Then the signs began. A row of leaves turned upside down along the barn wall, a feather wedged under the latch. Mabel knew enough by now to recognize what they meant. Warning, intrusion. She looked to Royce, who was already loading his rifle, not to fire, but to make noise if they needed a distraction. The brothers were coming. That night, the rain started. Soft at first, then harder, drumming on the roof like 1,000 small fists. Mabel didn't sleep. Neither did Keeva. He sat near the door, alert, his shoulders tense, his fingers gripping the edge of a wooden beam. Mabel crouched beside him, her knees aching from the cold floor, and laid a hand on his back. Just once. He didn't flinch. He didn't lean in, but he stayed. Then, sometime before dawn, Mabel noticed something outside the barn window. A trail of leaves, shaped like maple, arranged in a long, winding line, leading away from the barn and down toward the creek bed. Not toward town, away. Keeva had made it. A false trail. He was trying to buy them time. Royce didn't ask questions. He just nodded, grabbed the lantern, and readied the truck. They didn't have long. As they pulled the doors closed behind them, Mabel noticed something on the wood. A smear. Dark, sticky. Not blood. Tree sap, thick and golden, dragged into 3 parallel lines across the door. Not random. Not a mess. A message. She didn't need Royce to explain it. She didn't need words. It was a promise. Someone was watching. Someone was protecting. By the time the Mays brothers made it to the barn, the place was empty. The floor swept. The footprints smudged. The only thing left was a single acorn shell placed on the windowsill, and a thin thread of sap that glistened like lightning frozen in wood. Coulter hesitated before stepping inside. Dax didn't, but even he moved quieter than usual, as if the walls themselves were listening. They didn't find anything. Not really, but they knew. Something had been there, and it hadn't run. It had outwitted them. Mabel didn't return to the barn. She didn't need to. The forest had spoken, and now it was watching who listened. Under a sky smeared with the dull gray of late summer overcast, the old barn sat like a breath held too long. Damp air hung inside like a soaked rag, and the cracked beams moaned with every shift of wind. Mabel watched Keeva from the edge of the doorway, one hand resting on the old lantern's glass, her fingers curled loosely, not in fear, not anymore. The boy moved with more confidence now, still slow, still deliberate, but less like a wounded thing and more like something waking from a long, ancient sleep. She'd started placing food outside each morning, roots, berries, sometimes a strip of jerky left on a flat stone just beyond the line of dirt she'd drawn as a silent agreement. Keeva never stepped past that line, but every evening the food was gone, and something small was left in return. A shell, a fern frond tied in a knot, once a perfect circle of river pebbles with a dandelion in the center. She never asked what it meant. She didn't need to. The meaning was in the gesture. The rules formed slowly. Don't speak his name, don't touch, don't follow if he wanders. Let him come to her on his own terms, and never more than that. Some days he disappeared into the woods entirely, only to return at dusk, brushing twigs from his fur and leaving wet prints across the wooden floor. Once, Mabel followed them to the stream and found a pile of cracked snail shells laid beside a smooth rock, as if he'd eaten there and then swept the space clean. Another time, she found a squirrel's skeleton buried shallow in a patch of moss, a neat row of leaves forming a half-moon above it. There was something ritualistic in the way he moved through the world, not wild, but purposeful, like every action whispered back to something older than speech. Then came the disappearance. One morning, Keeva didn't come back, not for breakfast, not for water, not for the little stone path she left him, pointing toward a patch of berries growing behind the barn. The hours stretched thin. She searched without looking like she was searching, walked slow around the perimeter, eyes sweeping for signs, branches broken low, patterns in the grass, piles of pine needles turned wrong. Nothing. The second day passed the same. The third brought rain, steady and cold. Mabel sat on the porch wrapped in an oilskin coat, her boots soaking through, her hands gripping the mug that had long since gone cold. She didn't cry. She'd buried too much to waste tears on what wasn't final. But the ache sat behind her ribs like a stone that wouldn't shift. Then, on the fourth day, just before dusk, she heard a rustle, light, careful, and close. She stepped outside, and there he was, dragging behind him a branch strung with limp crayfish, their shells still damp and glistening. Keeva's fur was matted, thick with burrs and dried mud, but his gait was steadier. He looked at her, not directly, but near enough to feel the weight of his eyes. She didn't run to him. She didn't praise him. She stepped aside and held the door open. He walked in, that night, after he curled up in the barn's loft again. She stared at the ceiling a long while, the sound of rain threading through the cracks like whispers. Her breath slowed. Something had changed. Not in him, in her. She'd stopped waiting for him to leave. The next morning, Royce arrived before dawn. He didn't knock, just leaned on the doorframe with his hat in his hand, eyes grave. "They're still poking around," he said. "Heard Dax bought a new trap. One of those industrial snare types, steel teeth, illegal as hell, but no one's checking up this far." Mabel didn't flinch. "They'll try again, and harder," he added. She turned back toward the barn. "Then we buy time." By noon, Royce had returned with a sack of rusted roofing nails and a pair of thick gloves. They worked without speaking, scattering the nails along the back road, hidden beneath fallen leaves and soft dirt. Not enough to maim, just enough to slow, to frustrate, to make them reconsider. That evening, Royce drafted a false report. Citing illness, requested a temporary suspension from Ranger Patrol for 2 weeks. He sealed it in an envelope and drove it into town himself. He chose conscience over duty, like he always had, like Mabel knew he would. Later that week, a truck pulled up outside the barn. Not the maze this time, but a beat-up Chevy with one mirror missing and a long braid of feathers tied to the antenna. Tilda Rowan stepped out, leaning heavy on her cane, wearing 3 scarves and boots older than some trees. She didn't ask permission, just walked around the barn in silence, touching the door frame, kneeling to brush her hand across a pile of leaves beside the wall. Then she nodded to herself. "Cedar's strong here," she said. "Memory clings to it. That boy's not your burden, Mabel Quinn. He's your mirror." Mabel didn't answer, just stepped aside and let her in. Inside, Tilda sat cross-legged on the barn floor and emptied her pockets. Bundles of herbs, bits of string, a smooth stone carved with spiral markings. Keeva watched her from the loft, head tilted like a curious fox. She held up a braided clump of dried grass and smiled. "Language," she said. "Not ours, but theirs. We forget how to read it. But it's there." She showed Mabel the meanings. Stones in a line meant passage. Grass bent clockwise, a warning. Acorn shells with the cap removed, peace. She said the boy was speaking every day, just not in words. They needed to start listening properly. When she left, Tilda pressed a bundle of cedar shavings into Mabel's hand. "Lay this outside your door. Let the forest know you're listening." That night, Keeva placed something at the barn entrance. A braid of dried reeds, looped once, then twice, then tied with a sliver of bark. 2 lines converging into one. Mabel sat with it in her lap for an hour before she understood. He was asking not just for safety, but for place, for permanence, for her answer. She didn't sleep. The next morning, when she stepped out to tend the chickens that hadn't laid in weeks, she found a fresh rabbit pelt folded beside the porch. Not hunted, offered, clean. Not a drop of blood. She looked up and saw nothing but fog curling between the trees. But she knew. They weren't alone anymore. And as the sun crept through the mist, drawing gold lines across the barn roof, Mabel made her decision, not in words, but in motion. She pulled the cedar charm from her coat pocket and nailed it to the door. Not inside. Outside, facing the woods, and from far off in the distance, just beneath the wind, she thought she heard a sound, like breath held. Then, let go. It began with rain, one of those slow, steady spring rains that never stops but never quite pours. The kind that turns the whole forest into breath, mist curling off the tree trunks like memory come loose. The barn creaked under its own age, softened by the weather, and somewhere deep in the rafters, a small leak tapped out a rhythm into an old bucket Mabel had placed days ago. She sat at the edge of the loft, watching the gray light shift, knowing the rhythm of the day would be different now. Something had shifted, and it wasn't just the season. The door opened without warning. She turned, hand instinctively brushing the lantern beside her. But it wasn't Royce or Tilda. It wasn't anything she expected. It was a woman, young, maybe mid-20s, soaked through her coat, hair stuck to her face, glasses fogged from the sudden change in air. She clutched a satchel to her chest and stared like she wasn't sure if she'd walked into someone's dream or her own mistake. Mabel stood but didn't speak. There was no need. The girl's eyes said it all. Caught in the rain, looking for shelter, not knowing she'd stepped into something older than stories. I'm just trying to wait out the storm," the girl said, the words catching in her throat, a tremor behind them like a skipped beat. Her voice cracked slightly, the way people's voices do when they're fighting nerves too old to explain. Mabel nodded once, stepping back. "You're welcome to." The girl eased inside, slow, unsure, then stopped cold as her gaze slid past the edge of the barn's loft. Keeva was there, not hiding, not running, just standing in the shadows. watching her. He didn't growl. He didn't move. He simply stepped forward, only one step, and held something out in his palm, a hollowed acorn shell. The woman froze, mouth open slightly, but no scream came. No flinch either. Just this wide-eyed stillness, like her body was waiting to see what her heart already knew. Keeva tilted his head, then gently shook the shell. Inside it was something small, maybe a seed or pebble, and it rattled like the softest wind chime, barely audible over the sound of rain. The woman's name was Iris. Mabel learned that later. For now, all that mattered was the moment that passed between them. The offering, the acceptance. When Keeva placed the shell in Iris's hand, she didn't recoil. Her fingers closed around it like she was holding a secret no one else had ever trusted her with. And then something even stranger happened. Iris spoke. Not perfectly, not without hesitation, but clearly. The thank you. No stutter. Mabel didn't mention it, just watched. The rain kept falling, and in the hush of that barn, something new took root. That evening, Iris helped carry water from the creek without being asked. She fed the hens behind Mabel's cabin and sat quietly beside Keeva as he stacked stones, mimicking the patterns he made with her own trembling hands. She didn't ask what he was. She didn't label him. She just stayed present. And sometimes that's all it takes. That night, thunder rolled low in the hills, and the sky cracked open. The storm turned sharp, heavy, unrelenting. Mabel wrapped her coat tighter and stepped outside to check the footbridge, an old wooden crossing that ran over a narrow creek between the barn and her house. The lantern's flame danced wildly in the wind. She made it halfway across before the boards gave beneath her. She didn't scream, just fell. She must have hit her head on the rock below, because the next thing she knew, there was no rain, no light, just the sound of water rushing past, and a pulsing ache behind her eyes. Her body was too heavy to move. The mud gripped her coat like hands. Back at the barn, Keeva sat still as stone, eyes fixed on the door. Then he moved, not like a child, like a sentinel. He picked up Mabel's old leather satchel, her daughter's initials still stitched into the side, and slung it over his back. Then he ran, barefoot, soaked, wind battering his face. He ran through brush and over ridges, 7 miles without pause, until he reached the edge of the road, where the faint glow of Iris's truck still sat under the tree line. He didn't knock. He stood there, arms out, rain soaking his fur until the leather darkened and stuck to his shoulders. When Iris opened the door, she didn't scream, didn't question. She looked at him, then looked at the bag. "I understand," she whispered. By the time they reached Mabel, the creek had begun to rise. Iris splashed through knee-deep water to get to her, struggling to lift her half-conscious frame from the rocks. Keeva stepped into the current without hesitation, his arms steady as he helped brace Mabel's shoulders. Together they pulled her up the bank and into the dry. Then came headlights. 2, bright, blinding, Dax and Coulter. Their truck screeched to a stop just off the path, the tires spitting gravel like teeth. Dax jumped out first, rifle raised, eyes already wild. But what he saw stopped him cold. It wasn't a beast dragging a body. It wasn't an attack or a chase. It was a boy. Covered in fur, yes, taller than a man, yes. But a boy, soaked through, helping a woman breathe. There was no aggression, no threat. Just the tremble of urgency and the quiet ache of care. Coulter stepped out slower, rifle lowered. His eyes never left Keeva. The storm churned around them, lightning splitting the sky in uneven bursts, thunder slamming against the ridgeline. But still, no one moved. Then, from the tree line, a figure stepped forward. Not rushing, not looming, just arriving. Elder, taller than Keeva, broader. His fur dark as tree bark soaked in oil. The rain slid down his shoulders in ribbons. And his face, human-like wildman face, amber eyes. Still, measured, wise. No anger, No fear, just presence. He stood at the edge of the light, one hand lowered beside him, the other touching his chest. A gesture, a greeting. Iris stepped in front of Mabel, and without being told, she returned the gesture. Coulter lowered his rifle completely. Dax hesitated. The thunder cracked again. Then he dropped the barrel toward the mud. None of them spoke. None of them needed to. In that storm, something passed between them that would never make it into any story told over beers or hunting trips. A silent understanding that none of this belonged to them, that what they had witnessed was not theirs to take or name. Elder blinked once, then turned. Keeva followed, and the trees closed behind them. Mabel didn't wake until dawn. Her face was pale, breath shallow, but steady. Iris sat beside her, soaked through, her back pressed to the cabin wall. In her lap, the acorn shell Keeva had given her rattled once in the morning breeze, like wind through memory. No one spoke of the storm again, not in town, not in papers. And when someone asked Dax what he'd been hunting up in the hills that week, he just shook his head and said, "Something that doesn't want to be found." But even that wasn't the truth, because what they'd seen wasn't hiding. It had come forward. It had chosen to be seen. Under a pale slate sky, with spring not quite finished unthawing the woods, Royce packed the truck in silence. The old Ford creaked under the weight of the supplies. 2 jugs of water, a canvas sack of dried fruit, 1 lantern, and an emergency flare Mabel had insisted he take. Keeva stood nearby, one hand resting on the tailgate, the other holding a loop of braided twine. He was quieter than usual, still, but not frightened. His shoulders had filled out, his movements less cautious now, more assured. The wild hadn't claimed him, not fully, not yet. But Royce could see it tugging at him like a tide. The map lay open across the hood, its folds worn thin, corners soft from years of use. Royce traced his finger toward a narrow stretch in the limestone cliffs south of Allegheny, a place that hadn't seen hikers in decades. An old migration corridor, long forgotten, mentioned once in a 1954 field report buried beneath years of logging permits and weather charts. The kind of place animals remembered, but men forgot. They left just after first light. Iris came to say goodbye, her hands pressed into her coat pockets like she wasn't sure if she should speak or just let the moment be what it was. Mabel didn't say much either, just placed a cedar branch inside Keeva's satchel and touched his shoulder briefly. He looked at her for a long time, eyes amber, soft, and then climbed into the back seat without a sound. They drove north first, then west, skirting through unmarked roads and overgrown trails. Royce knew these logging paths like old songs, half remembered, half instinct. They passed abandoned rail ties, rusted gas cans, a crumpled picnic table half swallowed by blackberry bramble. No signs, no tourists, just the hush of a place that had long since slipped off the map. That night, they camped in the shell of a forgotten ranger outpost. Royce set up the fire with hands that moved slower than they used to. Keeva watched, then took the flint from him and struck it clean in one try. Royce didn't say anything, just nodded. He handed the boy a tin bowl of beans, and they ate in the quiet. The only sounds were the wind pushing through broken window frames and the distant cry of an owl above the ridge. Later, when the fire dimmed, Keeva pulled a thin branch from his pack and started pressing stones into the dirt in a spiral, the way Tilda had shown him. A sign of crossing, Royce lay back on his roll, arms folded behind his head, and looked up through the gap in the roof. Stars blinked through like old friends. "You'll be safe there," he said. Not sure if the boy would understand the words, but saying them anyway. Or at least, freer. The next morning, fog sat heavy along the tree line. They climbed the last stretch on foot, weaving between deadfall and soft shale. Keeva moved without slipping once. Royce followed slower, feeling the weight of every year, every decision. Then came the sound of tires. Crushed gravel. Too close. He turned fast, heart kicking once in his chest. Two men stood at the edge of the mist, rifles slung, boots caked in mud. Dax and Coulter. Dax spoke first. "That it?" He nodded toward Keeva, already stepping forward. Coulter didn't move. His hands stayed loose at his sides, his face unreadable. Royce stepped between them, voice low. "Back off." Dax smirked, raising his rifle just slightly. "We're not here for a fight. Just need proof. Something real, enough to make what we saw worth it." Keeva didn't run, didn't flinch. He stood tall, his shoulders squared, eyes calm. Then the fog shifted. A darker shape moved behind them, silent as snowfall. Elder emerged from the mist. 8.5 feet of motionless presence, his fur damp with morning dew, his human-like wild man face calm but unblinking. Amber eyes locked on Dax's without hate, without fear, just watching, judging, like a mirror held too close. Dax hesitated, fingers tightening on the rifle. But Elder didn't move, didn't snarl, didn't warn. He simply stepped forward, placed a hand, enormous and steady, on Keeva's shoulder, then looked at Coulter. That's when it broke. Coulter lowered his rifle first. "I'm done," he muttered. "I'm not shooting something that helps people." Dax stared at him, then at Keeva, then back at Elder. His hands trembled once, then dropped. Royce exhaled, slow. "Then help me. You want redemption? Start with that trail you tore up. Rip out every trap, every snare. Tell the others this land is watched now." Neither brother argued. They nodded and disappeared down the hill without a word. Keeva turned toward Mabel's old cedar branch, pulled it from his pack, and tied it gently to a branch near the trail's edge. Then he stepped back, looked at Royce, and held his arms out. The hug wasn't long, it wasn't tight, but it was enough. It was real. Royce didn't speak, just placed a weathered hand on the boy's back for one last moment. The lantern was burning low in the grass. The morning was thick with silence. Keeva turned, stepped into the fog. Elder followed, and the woods closed behind them like they'd never been there at all. What remained was a line of river stones, drawn from trailhead to thicket, clean, unbroken, and straight as an oath. Beneath the slow-turning weight of another year, the Adirondacks settled into silence. Not the hush of fear or distance, but the quieter kind. The kind that arrives after something sacred has passed through and left a mark behind. Mabel Quinn's world had grown softer since Keeva left. Not easier, just quieter. The kind of quiet that held echoes in its teeth and memories like seeds tucked deep into soil, waiting for the right light to bloom again. She spent her mornings with paper and ink, the old kind she'd once saved for tax records and grocery lists. Now she used it to keep time. The brown journal lay open beside her tea, each page filled not with dates or names, but offerings, things the forest left, things only she would notice, things that wouldn't mean anything to someone else unless they'd once held hands with something wild. That summer she found a brook trout, dead but not decayed, laid just beneath her window. Its scales still shimmered in the early sun, its gills unmarked. No claw, no tooth, as if it had been caught and set aside. For her, a gesture. The fish was untouched, still whole. She didn't cook it. She buried it beneath the lilacs behind her shed. That fall, the leaves came down in spirals. Most covered the walkways in familiar scatter. But one morning she opened her door and found a line of red maple leaves shaped into a crescent curve around the edge of her yard. Not a pattern made by wind, not a child's prank. They curled delicately toward the old trap path she'd once reported. A warning, a reroute, a kindness. She left a ribbon of cornmeal beside the porch that day, dusted in a wide arc, and it stayed untouched for weeks, until the first frost kissed it clean and wind lifted the rest into the trees. Winter came without announcement. One morning frost bloomed along the edges of the barn and didn't leave. That's how she knew. The nights grew sharper, branches snapped under ice like brittle bones. But every dawn, just before the sky broke pink, Mabel would step outside with her robe pulled tight and find a set of prints near her porch. Too large to be deer, too wide apart to be human. The snow there was packed but never disturbed, as if something had stood between her and the wind all night long. She didn't chase it. She didn't look for more. It was enough to know she wasn't forgotten. When spring stirred again, gentle and quiet as breath on a window, the school let Iris Beaumont start a class of her own. Not just reading or numbers, but something else. A quiet curriculum. Mixed ages. No tests. Just presence. On Tuesdays, they walked. She led the children to the edge of the forest and had them gather the smallest bits, twigs, leaves, pine cones, and arrange them without speaking. Some days they braided vines. Other days they just sat in the moss. She taught them how to listen with their bodies, how to understand that not every voice needs sound, that silence could mean gratitude, that stillness could mean respect. She didn't use the word Bigfoot. No one did anymore. They simply called it the quiet thing. The neighbor who once took the money said nothing. One morning, Mabel found an envelope slid into her mailbox with no return address. Inside was a folded note and $75. The handwriting was messy. No name. Just the words, "I'm sorry. Let me help fix what I broke." She donated the money to the trail fund. Royce didn't go back to the ranger station. He said he was tired of paperwork and tired of silence being punished. He stayed instead, taking up the job of the forest's janitor, clearing paths, hauling trash out from the places tourists never saw. He worked alone most days, but always left the path clear behind him. Once, he found a deer skull set neatly in the crook of a tree, its antlers draped in dried moss. He nodded at it and kept walking. He didn't tell anyone, not even Mabel, but he knew. That spring, when the wildflowers came too early and the birds too late, Mabel felt the first tightness in her chest. A flutter at first, then a weight. She told no one, not even Iris, but she started walking slower, breathing harder. The letters in her journal got smaller, more careful. Some days she just drew instead. A page of acorn shells, a braid of grass. 2 lines, parallel at first, then slowly drifting apart. She wrote a letter to Keeva, not with words, but with images. A river, a cedar branch split in half, a heart with no outline, only shadow. She didn't seal it. She left it open on the table beneath the lantern. One morning she couldn't rise. She lay in bed, the window open just enough to let in the scent of rain. Her hands were folded across her chest, fingers curled slightly, not in pain, but in memory. A single breeze lifted the edge of the letter beside her, then let it fall. She wasn't alone when she passed. Some said they saw a figure on the porch that morning, tall, still, holding nothing but the edge of the railing. No one took a picture, no one knocked. The next week, Royce found the journal on the table. Beside it sat a bundle of cedar, tied in grass, and a smooth black stone in the shape of a heart. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't cold either. He left it exactly where it was. The town didn't hold a funeral, but people came anyway. Iris lit a candle in the classroom. The children brought small things, twigs, feathers, wild violets. They left them at the edge of the woods just before the tree line. No one spoke. Later that season, someone noticed that all the old traps along the western trail had been uprooted. Not destroyed, just gone. In their place were circles of stones. That summer, the trailhead was closed for repairs. Volunteers rebuilt the bridge, cleared the path, and painted a new sign in quiet colors. Let the forest be. Let what lives here stay unknown. That autumn, a boy hiking with his grandfather found an acorn shell sitting on a stump. Inside was a dried berry and a folded grass braid. The grandfather told him not to touch it. "That's someone else's," he said. The boy nodded and walked on. At night sometimes, Iris still hears the sound. Just once, just faint. A breath behind the pines. She never looks back, not because she's afraid, because she knows what's there. And what still waits. It started with thunder that didn't come from the sky. The ground trembled before anyone heard the strike, a low vibration that moved through roots and floorboards and the backs of spines. By the time the wind shifted, by the time the animals fell quiet, the flames had already taken hold. A bolt had carved down through the highest pine near Dry Creek, splintering it into smoke and coals, and from there, the fire took breath. Not fast, not wild, but purposeful. It moved like memory. Slow at first, then sharp. Trees groaned as their bark peeled, then lit with the ease of old newspaper. By mid-afternoon, the smoke could be seen from town. A thick, orange-gray rope, twisting above the ridgeline, pushing east. The wind had changed. That was the worst part. A cold front rolling in from the north, dry and fierce, carrying ash like seed across the hills. People gathered without being told. Old men with rakes, young mothers with garden hoses, teenagers in borrowed boots with red bandanas pulled over their mouths. No official call came, no evacuation notice. Just instinct. And fear. Royce had already seen the smoke by then. He stood on the edge of Iris's classroom, watching it rise above the tree line like a second sun. He didn't say anything. Just walked back to his truck and pulled out the old canvas sack Mabel had once used for creekside foraging. He filled it with green pine boughs, the freshest he could find, and passed them to the children one by one. Wet 'em. Use 'em to slap the ground if the fire jumps. Stay low. Breathe slow. Don't run unless someone tells you to. The forest was loud now. Wind shoving branches, birds cutting fast across the sky, the sharp pop of old limbs catching fire from miles away. Iris stood beside the road with her sleeves rolled up, eyes fixed westward, hands already black with soot. She didn't blink when the first cinder landed on the school's tin roof. She just climbed the ladder and stamped it out herself. Then came the others. Abner brought buckets. Tilda brought willow bark soaked in spring water and told anyone who'd listen to smear it across their cheeks and foreheads to keep from breathing too much heat. No one questioned her. Not now, not anymore. Then someone shouted. A child had slipped near the bend. The earth had cracked at the far edge of the firebreak, a jagged drop where the hillside had crumbled. A little girl, maybe 6, had lost her footing chasing her younger brother, and now dangled from a sheet of broken brush, her scream thin against the roar of wind and flame. No one reached her in time. But something did. A hand, large, fur-covered, broad as a catcher's mitt, shot out from the smoke and caught her beneath the arms. It lifted her back to solid ground with one smooth motion. The girl turned, eyes wide, mouth open, but said nothing. The figure was already gone. She said later it smelled like cedar and dirt. No one questioned that either. The smoke grew thicker. The fire pushed harder. People stood with shirts over their faces, faces smeared in sweat and ash. And then, through the smoke, they saw them. Not just one, several. Tall shapes moving through the edge of flame. Not fleeing, not afraid, but holding position. One raised an arm and pointed, not toward the people, but to the sky. The wind was shifting again, and fast. A burst of hot air rushed west, curling the fire's edge, turning it from the village path toward the ravine. They weren't chasing the fire away. They were standing in its way. Royce stood still, his heart thudding, not from fear, but from the impossibility of what he was seeing. One of the shapes moved closer, just enough to meet his eyes. Elder. Royce didn't speak, just nodded. The wind broke then, as if it had been waiting. The fire curved sharp left, away from the edge of town, following the draw of its own breath, down into the natural fire basin past the ridge. The worst was avoided. Not extinguished, but rerouted. Allowed to burn where it could do no more harm. When the flames died down enough for the smoke to settle, the tall shapes were gone. No footprints, no sound, just a hush. Mabel's house was untouched, but the next morning the porch held a single smudge, one large handprint, pressed gently into the soot-streaked railing. Not heavy, not deep, just enough. 3 days later, Mabel passed in her sleep. Iris found her at dawn. The window still cracked, the curtains gently stirring. A cup of tea, still warm, sat beside her bed, untouched. The letter she'd written for Keeva, nothing more than lines and symbols, lay atop her quilt. 2 lines, drawn straight and parallel. Then one veered slightly, curling toward a shape that looked like the rising edge of a hill. Royce came to help bury her. He didn't bring a shovel, just a bundle of cedar branches, a stone carved with a spiral, and her old handkerchief, stitched with her daughter's initials, folded once, then again. They laid her near the edge of the woods, just far enough that the light touched her first thing in the morning. The town didn't build a statue, didn't plant a plaque, but they made a decision. No more traps, no more cameras, no more naming what didn't want to be known. They left the forest alone. From that point on, whenever someone saw something strange at the edge of the trees, something tall, watching, neither animal nor man, they didn't call it a monster. They didn't call it anything at all. One fog-thick morning, months later, Iris walked the children up the newly restored trail. Just beyond the clearing, she stopped. There, in the soft earth beside the lowest stone step, was a footprint. Large, bare, pressed clean into the soil. Not new, but not yet faded. The children didn't speak, they just looked. Then, through the trees, a shape passed. Not fast, not afraid. Keeva, taller now, fur darker. On his shoulder a small bundle, arms a smaller one. A child. He didn't stop, didn't wave. But he turned his head for a moment, just enough, and Iris placed a hand over her heart. She didn't say goodbye. She just listened. As the group turned back toward town, the wind passed through the acorn shells still hanging on the porch roof. One of them hollowed, one of them split, both of them humming. The sound wasn't a cry, wasn't a warning. It was memory, and it stayed. Sometimes, the quietest stories are the ones that stay with us the longest, not because they were the loudest or the most dramatic, but because they reminded us of something we'd nearly forgotten. That connection doesn't always begin with words. That compassion isn't a grand performance. It's a gesture, a pause, a willingness to kneel when someone else cannot stand. It's a cup of water left on a step, a cedar branch laid at a door, a silence shared and respected, rather than filled. There's something unspoken in the bond between human beings and the unknown, a recognition that maybe, just maybe, the world is not ours to own, but to walk beside. That wonder still exists, deep in the woods, in the hearts of those who choose to listen instead of conquer, who protect instead of pursue. At the heart of it, this story wasn't about monsters or mysteries. It was about mercy, about the courage it takes to care for something we don't understand, about the dignity of letting go without forgetting, and about how grief, when met with grace, can become a bridge instead of a burden. There's an old belief that the wild doesn't test us, it reveals us. That in the presence of something ancient, our truest selves come forward. Not the version that needs to prove or fight, but the one that remembers what it means to be part of something larger, quieter, more enduring. A forest isn't made by one tree. It's the space between them, the shelter they give each other, the way they rise together even when storms come. And maybe people are the same. We live in a world that often moves too fast to notice what waits in the margins. But every once in a while, a story comes along that asks us to slow down, to step off the path, to look not with suspicion, but with reverence. It's in those moments, soft, fleeting, imperfect, that we become who we were meant to be. Not rulers of this earth, but stewards of its mysteries, protectors of its quiet miracles. So if this story touched something in you, if it made you feel less alone or more awake to the sacredness of small things, hold on to that. Let it guide the way you move through the world, the way you speak to others, the way you listen, because there are still songs being sung in the trees, still footsteps we were never meant to chase, only honor, still hands reaching out, Not to take, but to thank. And if you're quiet enough, kind enough, still enough, maybe you'll feel one brush yours someday. Thank you for being here, for listening all the way to the end. It means more than you know. If this story resonated with you, please leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you haven't yet, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss what's coming next. There's more to share, more to remember, and more reasons than ever to keep walking gently through this world. Until next time, stay kind, stay curious, and keep your lantern lit.